Welcome to our peer session. I'd like to ask everybody how they're doing, but I don't think I'm going to hear you, but I'm going to ask anyway. I hope you're all doing great. So far, it's been an amazing conference. The GRIT team and all the guests, it's been really awesome to watch. It's fun to be part of this. I hope this next hour is going to be really good, and we got some great guests with lots and lots of experience. We have people from different countries, different experiences, different cancer tumor types, etc. And what we're going to be talking about today is PEER, or the idea of PEER and how it came about and why it came about. I'm Jim Howley. I work for BMS. I started back in March. I'm the Global Director of Patient Advocacy for Hematology. I have worked in advocacy for well over 20 years. Prior to here, I was with a company in California working in oncology and hematology, and prior to that, worked with Abbott and AbbVie, working across from HIV, hepatitis, all the immune diseases. But the one thing that I have that I'm very, very proud of is I personally am a 2-time cancer survivor, an HIV and AIDS survivor. And what all that has in common with PEER is it really helped saving my life to have the right conversation with the right people that really had the information, and I had information to share back. And that's what PEER is about, which is an expert patient giving input into the development of treatments that hopefully will come and help make people's lives better, or maybe even someday be a cure. So enough about me. I'd love to introduce the group. If I could have them introduce themselves, because they have such amazing stories to tell. And I'd like to start with Deb Maskins.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody. So Deb Maskins here. I'm a Canadian. I live near Toronto. Thank you, Jim, and everybody for organizing this panel. I guess I'm an expert patient. I've had metastatic cancer for 24 years, something like that, kidney cancer, and I've become a patient advocate. But I started off as a patient, like a deer in the headlights, and now I'm happy to be able to contribute to something like this peer group. So looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Deb. And Lorna Warwick.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lorna Warwick, and I am the CEO of the Lymphoma Coalition. The Lymphoma Coalition is a global network of patient organizations. So we work with 83 different organizations in 52 countries around the world. All of these organizations provide some support of some kind to patients with lymphomas, including CLL. And the coalition focuses on providing really good, credible information to make sure patients are well informed, as well as advocating to ensure access to good quality care right across the spectrum.
Thanks, Lorna. Glad to have you here. And my colleague and good friend, Brian Lee.
Hi, Jim. Thanks. So I'm Brian Lee. I'm Director of Global Advocacy within Bristol Myers Squibb. I actually cover cardiovascular, fibrosis, multiple sclerosis, and life cycle management. And I've led the PEER initiative over the last 2 years. So I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm glad you're here. And before we get too much into PEER, it's the idea of PEER I'd like to really talk about right now. The idea of PEER is patient expert engagement resource. And what that means is, how do we get the patient voice, the patient experience, not just patient reported outcomes, but everything about what the patient experiences transactionally, what's it like to go through what they're going through, emotionally, what does this mean to them? How should these clinical trials be developed so that they're a little bit more user-friendly? So before we jump right into PEER, what I'd like to do is ask each of you, tell me your experience of why it's important and the historical engagement of getting the patient voice into the pharmaceutical industry development teams and clinical trials. Could we start with Lorna?
Sure. So really what we have to think about here is what patients actually need when they're looking at their care for their cancer. Sometimes what a patient wants is very different than what a clinician or a researcher thinks. And so the patients, as the end user of the system, really have some very specific knowledge that those other groups won't have. And if we don't include that information upfront into therapy design, then we're missing a very important piece of the equation. So for instance, if you're looking at what side effects are considered tolerable for a patient, or what kind of quality of life that they're going to have or have had to date because of their therapy, all of these things we need to include in that initial design to make sure that new therapies coming to market are really targeting the issues that are of the highest importance to a patient.
Thanks, Lorna. I appreciate it. Let me turn this over to Deb. Again, what some historic engagement and why it's so important.
I'm taking off mute, but Jim, we've forgotten one of our panelists. So would you mind if I defer the answer and have you introduce Elizabeth?
I am so sorry, Deb. My screen, I am so technically challenged. I can't believe it. Elizabeth, I didn't forget you. Out of sight, out of mind. I'm a terrible person. Elizabeth, please, could you introduce yourself?
No worries. Well, we're all learning in the Zoom environment. And we were joking before we got started that our neighbors to the north are just kind of living their best life up there. So, it's fine to take us out, Jim. I'm totally fine with it. But thank you, Jim. My name is Elizabeth Franklin, and I am with an organization called the Cancer Support Community. We're international, but we're largely based in the United States, providing social and emotional support services for cancer patients and their loved ones. We provide about $50 million in free services to patients every year at our 170 locations. So I'm super thrilled to join you. I'm executive director of our Cancer Policy Institute, where we focus very heavily on the patient experience and making sure that the patient voice is heard. And in terms of my own personal background, I am an oncology social worker for the past 15 years. My career has been spent largely in policy, and both my mother and father are cancer survivors. So of course, this is very personal to me. And so that's me. And thank you, Deb, for deferring some of your time. And Jim, we'll get back on track. Don't worry.
Well, while I have you there, so I don't mess up again, can we talk a little bit about historic engagement and why it's so important to get the patient voice into industry at an early stage?
Absolutely. I think there are two sides to this. The first, of course, is because it's the right thing to do, right? We know, and Jim, I know this cause is close and personal to your heart. Looking back in the 80s with the AIDS crisis, we found out that level of activism to really ensure that the patient voice was being heard and understood was extraordinarily important. And, that term, nothing about us without us, which originated in the disability community, really is present for the cancer community as well. So we know that when patients are involved in clinical trials and in study design, you're just going to get better data. You're going to get what's important to them. So it's the right thing to do. On the other side of the equation, it's also something we have to do. And here's why. Beginning in 1978 with the Belmont Report, which is really what drives research, they say that we have to do two things when we involve human subjects in research, and that's do no harm, but also maximize benefit. And we can't maximize benefit unless we're really asking patients what they care about and what their real focus is. So from then, you look at the IOM report, Cancer Care for the Whole Patient. You look at the various standards that have come out, the 21st Century Cures Act, which required the FDA to include a statement about patient experience data. And what has really emerged over the last 30 years or so is that we don't have the full picture without focusing on what's important to patients and putting that out there in the world so that other patients can understand. And then I'll finally say, when we incorporate patients into trial designs, we are so much far ahead of the game in terms of policy, because when groups like ICER are looking at value, or when decision makers are looking at value, you've measured what's important to patients, and you're able to say, this is what a patient cares about, and this is what our drug or device or whatever it is able to produce, and how we're meeting the patient needs. So I'll just reiterate, it's the right thing to do, but it's also the thing we have to do in order to proceed and progress and make the best possible medications, devices, resources, and services for patients.
Amazing. And I never heard that background before. Very fascinating. Very fascinating. Thank you for that. And Deb, now if I could come back to you, and thank you so much for keeping us on the right track. I appreciate that.
That's never been said before. I'm usually the person to take us off the track and discuss other things. And so, Elizabeth, I understood everything that you said, and there are a lot of acronyms that as experienced patient advocates we throw around, like QALYs and ICERs and the various organization names. And I'm just thinking that if we have some patients and caregivers on this call or watching the video afterwards, that all might sound like, what on earth are these people talking about? Essentially, what we want to do as patients is to make sure that our voice and the voices of all of the people that we represent in our organizations is represented. And we talk about clinical trials, but really what we're talking about is, are the therapies that these companies are investing in, are they essentially what we want and what we need to fill the gaps in therapy? So I have metastatic kidney cancer, and one of the needs in our therapy area is for drugs that will help people live longer. I mean, ultimately we'll cure them of metastatic disease, and we're not there yet, but will help people live longer and live better. So that means quality of life and having a normal life as much as you can. And so as patients at the table, when these trials are first being discussed, we need to make sure that we're going to have the answer to that question. Does this therapy or combination help patients live longer? Does it help them live better? And hopefully both. And then in countries like mine, I live in Canada, but I'm familiar internationally with how we get drugs approved in our system. And this is true of many of the countries. We call them HTA countries, so Health Technology Assessment, where we not only look at new drugs, at the benefit, but we also look at the cost. So we look at the cost of the therapy, the benefit that the therapy brings, and what that means in terms of value. And that becomes a very difficult question for us to go to our governments with if we didn't ask the right questions all along. And so we want to make sure that we embed those questions in. What is this therapy like to live with every day? And how does it improve or maybe not improve your quality of life? And then we'll get the rich data, and then getting government reimbursement will be, and in the US case, it might be private insurance. But to get that reimbursement, so that's a slam dunk at the end when we've got good therapy. So that's why we do what we do.
It's a powerful combination. When you have the patients saying it's good and the science is saying it's good, that's a good combination. Well, like everything, it's a process, and we are going to be talking about PEER a little bit today. But before we go there, I think all of us have a good deal of experience. What hasn't worked? What have you seen that hasn't worked when it comes to clinical trial, getting feedback, not getting feedback, etc.? Let me jump back to Elizabeth on that.
Yeah, I think, and I appreciate all of Deb's comments and Lorna's. I think that also I'll address this in two different ways. One, patients and patient advocates can absolutely transparently see through companies and sponsors that don't meaningfully incorporate the patient voice, right? When it is a perfunctory, hey, don't forget, let's check the box, right? I see Deb going like that, let's check the box. We know what that looks like. We know what that feels like. And as a patient, that's actually more insulting, I think, than not being asked at all, right? To know that you're a cover. BMS doesn't do that, right? I think all of us work with BMS in a really meaningful way, and we're able to start from the beginning. When you come to us early and often, and when you say, we're thinking about this, how should we design this trial? What should we be thinking about? What do your patients care about? So for us at CSC, we have a cancer experience registry of about 15,000 patients. And when we're thinking about a disease state, we can actually look into those data points and pull what's important to patients and say, you really need to be focused on this. So a great example of this is actually to kind of tie back together the value piece and clinical trial piece. Right now, ICER in the United States is looking at bladder cancer. One of the most important things for patients with bladder cancer is the fact that they may lose their bladder, right? That's an extraordinary quality of life hurdle. That's something that the vast majority of people don't want to do. Some are not willing to do that. And so when we talk about bladder cancer treatments, we're talking about a very big jump in quality of life versus if there's a new treatment that they're able to access. So that's just one example. I always think about things like prostate cancer. I've talked with some prostate cancer patients who say, no matter what it takes, let's do it. I want the most aggressive treatment. And I've talked to other prostate cancer patients that say, if I have erectile dysfunction and incontinence, I would rather die. And so how can you serve those two patients exactly the same, right? You have to be having these conversations with patients to understand what they care about. And Deb and Lorna and I represent patients, but each patient is individual and different. So again, it's just so transparent when you're engaging with patients and patient advocates in a meaningful way. You just feel it in your heart and your soul, and you know when it works and when it doesn't. And I think that this panel and the work of PEER and BMS is a really important indication that BMS gets it, and that you're trying to improve it all the time, because we're not perfect. Nobody's going to knock it out of the park 100% of the time. And this is an indication that you're always trying to grow and improve the process.
I love the fact that you're talking about the same cancer the patients might want two very different things, and how important that is to give that feedback as well.
Absolutely.
Lorna, I want to ask you the same thing, but also I wanted, if you would, give your input, on how it feels to be running an organization that maybe you're not a patient in that sphere, because that happens quite a bit. It doesn't make it any less effective, sometimes more effective, but talk about that as well and what might not have worked in the past.
Definitely. So what we do at the Lymphoma Coalition is we do global patient surveys. So every 2 years, we actually go out with a very comprehensive survey globally, asking patients what their experience has been like. And it covers all kinds of different topics, very practical things about what therapies they may have received, to side effects they experience, the symptoms of the disease and what it feels like to actually be diagnosed with a lymphoma, the psychosocial impact, if you had any issues accessing care and what those were. So if you look at the survey that we just did at the beginning of 2020, we had almost 12,000 respondents globally. So this is a significant portion of patients, and we can examine this data all kinds of different ways. So even though I'm not a patient myself, I can look at data and understand some of the key issues that patients are facing. At the same point in time, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been working in the hematology space for 17 years. And in that time, I have spent a ton of time speaking one-on-one and in groups to all kinds of patients. So what I also like to let people know is that it's a privilege to have the patient voice and to be able to bring it into this conversation, but that also needs to be endorsed by the patient population themselves. And so constantly I'm double checking what we learn in our surveys through actual conversations and getting validation for what we are hearing and what we're saying to make sure that we're presenting it correctly. And so if we bring this back a little bit to this conversation about clinical trials and what works and what doesn't, then what has happened a lot in the past is that we'll have a research group, whether that's driven by a pharmaceutical company or doctors, come to us and say, we're having a really hard time recruiting patients to this clinical trial. And then we look at the criteria that they've established in the trial, and we're like, well, no wonder. What you're asking of a patient is not what they would want to do for either the age they are or the position that they are within their patient experience, or perhaps because, the expectation with testing, et cetera, is far more than what they would experience with conventional therapy that might work okay. And so that we can pull from the clinical trial, from the patient survey data, and really know what our patients are experiencing over all kinds of different subsets. So as I just mentioned, with lymphomas, we have two kind of peaks. So we have patients that are young adults, right? So adolescents and young adults that are diagnosed, and then another group that's diagnosed when they're age 50 plus. And how those two age groups react even to a trial or potential therapy is different, never mind looking at the different types of lymphoma. And right now there are over 80 different subtypes. So it's a very complex issue, but it's also explains why it is so important to engage a patient voice early to make sure that it's actually addressing the need of the community you're trying to serve.
Wow, 12,000 respondents. I talked to a lot of groups. They would love to have that kind of response. And that's from all over the world, right? How many countries?
Yeah, the survey actually, even though we have patient groups in 52 countries, we get far more that participate in the survey. So I think our latest count is, I'd have to go look, but it's over 60. So it's pretty good.
Wow.
Truly global, truly global. All right, Deb, I'd love to hear your experiences. And again, I'd love to hear what didn't work this time.
Oh boy, what didn't work? So first of all, let me just address what Lorna has said, and with kidney cancer, we do the same. In fact, right now, our global kidney cancer survey is in the field, and we follow on Lorna's footsteps. So these advocates work together, and sometimes I think it's an advantage for somebody not to be a patient themselves, because in this journey, as advocates, we're not there to represent ourselves or our own opinions. And one of the key terms that we float around is evidence-based advocacy. And so a patient survey, and especially a global patient survey with thousands of respondents, gives us the evidence so that we're just not at the table talking about what we personally think, although sometimes we have strong opinions and passions. So let me answer Jim's question about what hasn't worked in the past. I think in the past, we let the clinicians and researchers sit in a room by themselves and close the door and imagine what it must be like to be a patient. And some of them, rightly would say, well, I've had a cancer experience myself. Maybe somebody was stage 1 breast cancer 15 years ago, or somebody's father. So everybody is touched by cancer. We hear that all the time. But these scientists and researchers would sit in a room and come up with a clinical trial, go through all of that work, and then nobody would really be that interested in the trial. And as a patient group leader, I remember getting the call from one company that said, why aren't we seeing accrual to our trial? And I said, well, there's probably one good reason. Oh, and they were very interested. And I said, it's a stupid trial, that no patient in their right mind would sign up for that trial. What were you thinking? And, that has taken, I'd say, in my career as an advocate, a volunteer career, probably 12 to 15 years. And we're not there yet, because even as involved as we are, we're often still dealing with a cake that's, pretty much baked. And we really want to get to the table when we're just thinking about, should we do a trial in this space, and would this be of interest, and what interesting things could we learn in a trial? So I think we still got a long way to go. I'm impressed that this is happening, but let's not pretend that we're where we need to be. We're not.
Very, very good point. I'm going to turn to Brian. Now, Brian, you wear a couple different hats. You work directly, you're global director of advocacy in different therapeutic areas, but you really are spearheading the PEER program. Before we go into all the wonderful aspects that I know you want to talk about PEER, which there are many, can you talk about kind of where it came from and why it happened?
Sure, thanks, Jem. I'll say that PEER has taken quite a bit of time to launch, actually, and it should come as no surprise. It's a pretty large and intensive program that runs across the entire enterprise at BMS. Actually, when I joined BMS almost 4 years ago, we had heard throughout the company that advocates were interested in being involved with us much earlier within the development process. And that really is no surprise. I think the trend with the industry and with the healthcare sector has been moving in that direction for quite some time now. And I think the panelists here have really described why it's so important, why we need to do it. And I think we're making a lot of progress. And so we had heard this from a number of advocates really across all of the disease areas that we had been working with. And we started to coalesce the internal stakeholders as well as our advocacy partners across the portfolio to get their input. And really, it took about 2 years to create that detailed process, garner the buy-in from bottom up as well as from top down in order to really get PEER successfully launched. It took about 2 years, and we actually successfully launched PEER this May with really strong leadership support, garnered buy-in from, I think we worked with about 15 or 16 different functional teams across the organization. Bear in mind that BMS is not the largest pharmaceutical company out there, and it's not the smallest, but it's definitely taken quite a bit of time because there is a lot of detail, a lot of nuance, really identifying the specific spots that we should and need expert patient advocate input into our development process. And now it's officially formalized within our governance structures. So when you look at, for example, the creation of a protocol or protocol synopsis, which is essentially the concept of a protocol with those key points, it's officially within our process to get expert patient advocate feedback into the draft protocol synopsis. So that's before a protocol is finalized, before you have that 200, 300 page protocol that states out how the trial is. We're looking to get expert patient input really as early as possible, as early as we can have those discussions with our development teams.
So I have to ask you, could you break down a little bit more, because we have a very broad audience of different experiences. When you say protocol, what does that mean exactly? What goes into a protocol and what a protocol is?
Yeah, so when we look at a full protocol that has all the details for the entire study design for the trial, down to who's giving information to the patients, the number of doses, number of visits. But when you look at something like a protocol synopsis, it's really the concepts around the protocol, the key pieces, including the study design, such as comparator drugs, study logistics, like how many times the patients will visit the office, how many times they'll take a pill or get injections. A lot of those points will contribute to what we call patient burden, or our understanding of how burdensome the clinical trial may be on the patient. And a lot of that, we really do need feedback from the patient community, because as much as the researchers and folks within the company would like to think that we understand the patient, I think it's really the patient and the patient advocates that understand the nuances amongst the patient community. In addition, the protocol synopsis includes things like what sort of patient-reported outcomes tools we'll be using, what sort of endpoints are important, what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And I think the main piece is that at that stage, nothing is finalized for the protocol yet. So it's really the ideal time to get input from the patient community before we finalize anything or approve anything. Because once it's finalized, it takes a heck of a lot of money and time to change it.
So before I go back to the expert advocates, I'd love to also ask you, did you have any trouble in the beginning getting this up and rolling? What kind of things did you see?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think that's a great question, and it's really important to have industry perspective as well. Maybe not specific to PEER, but I've been in advocacy space for a little bit under a decade now, and I've always been trying to push to get patient input within our study design and protocols. Couple stories probably stick out on my mind. One is that in my prior experience, I was looking to get patient input into our study design and protocols, but when I had that discussion with my management and the management above that, the answer was actually one of our senior leaders doesn't want the patient community to provide input into the study design because they think they know better. They were kind of MD, PhD, someone who's been doing research in this space for decades, and just wasn't willing to accept suggestions from the patient community on study design. So that was one story. The other one was another time when we were trying to get input into a protocol for one of our key programs, and the advocacy group I was working with had gone through, identified some expert patient advocates to provide input. And then when I brought it to the study teams, I was essentially ghosted by the study teams. They just kind of ignored me, brushed me off, and it was really difficult to get some of this work done from bottom up, which is why for PEER, we have senior leadership support down from our CEO and chief executives, which has been instrumental in making sure that this initiative has run successfully.
Well, just from my own experience in advocacy, it's come a lot further at BMS, and I've seen it at some other companies. Everybody thinks it's a great idea, but to systematically put it in place, you guys, well before me, have done an amazing job. So let me turn to our expert advocates who have actually had some experience with the PEER process, although new. Elizabeth, let's start with you.
Yeah, and first, sure. And I first want to say to Brian, I never thought I'd hear the term ghosted as in reference to clinical trial design. So that's good. It's nice to hear it outside of the dating space. Yeah, I think Brian's right. I think starting, obviously he's contributed so much of his time to the PEER program in terms of what he's doing, getting that input and that buy-in from the top down. I think that, you know, having the CEO be on board with this, so you know that it's not just, I'll go back to what I said, you know, sort of the right thing to do versus what we have to do. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's something that BMS has committed that they have to do, right? And one thing that Brian said, and I want to really put a fine point on that because I don't think that the average patient understands. He said, you know, once it's all cooked and done, not only is it hard and expensive, it's virtually impossible to scale back at that point, right? One thing that we're often asking companies to think about is to incorporate patient experience metrics into their trial design. And so what that means is it's actually a step further than patient-reported outcomes. So while patient-reported outcomes are the what, the patient experience outcomes or metrics are the so what. So let's say, you know, you have neuropathy. That might mean something very different to me than it does to a musician, right? So that's the so what. What does that mean? And we've, you know, often had conversations with companies at a period where it's a little bit too late to incorporate that in. And we've been told, you know, to just add that one question would cost us $1 million, you know, and that's just a random number to kind of throw out there. But I did want to put a fine point on that because Brian mentioned how expensive it is. Clinical trials are the lifeblood of the pharmaceutical industry, and that's how they get drugs from, you know, through the R&D process to the market. And so it's an extraordinary process, and PEER is a really important way, and I think perhaps even a model for the rest of the industry to say, let's get buy-in from the top, let's make this into the culture of the organization and make sure that we're building it into everything that we do. So again, kudos to BMS. Brian has a big job. I know it's not been easy, as evidenced by the ghosting, and I'm sure that he's had many other instances of tough times because it is the right thing to do, but it's the hard thing to do. And so getting everybody to buy in, and I'll tell you that those MD, PhDs, they're tough. They're tough, and it's tough to get them to change and get them to come along. So kudos to Brian for leading this and to BMS for really committing to the PEER program.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, kudos to Brian. It's tough to compliment your coworker that much, but he does an amazing job with this. It keeps us on track. Now, somebody I don't think that would allow ghosting. Lorna, could you talk about your experience with PEER? I can't see you nor Deb getting ghosted in any way, shape, or form.
I take that as a compliment. So when I was first approached about participating in PEER, what I really like about this is that it is completely what I think is in the best interest of patients. There's no limits about what I can comment on. I can bring any commentary that I think is important for the patient population into any discussion. And for me, that's what's really important. It's not a case of just looking at this specific issue. When we're looking at early clinical trial design, we're bringing in all kinds of different feedback. Yes, on how much testing the patient might have, the numbers, the target audiences, who should be participating in the trial, and also able to highlight key concerns for patients. One thing I like to point out with lymphomas, when we do the global patient survey, we hear time after time after time that fatigue has the biggest impact on quality of life for patients. But when you then talk about fatigue with clinicians, they have a harder time giving the credibility to that statement that it deserves. in part because when you're working with doctors and clinicians, they very much like things that they're able to easily measure. So, you know, they can tell you how much cancer you have left in your system by doing specific measurements and tests. But fatigue is subjective, right? So it's about how you personally think that this has impacted you. And cancer-related fatigue is very different than regular fatigue. Yet, most of us, when someone says that they have, you know, they're tired, we're like, oh, well, we're all tired, you know, there's so much going on in the world, it's exhausting, but this is not the same thing. And again, physicians sometimes will say, but so many things contribute to fatigue. It could be emotional distress. It could be an actual physical reaction to a drug, and it could be lots of different things. And my answer is always like, so what? So measure them all. Because this is what's important to a patient. And so I really appreciate that we have that kind of ability to just bring everything into the conversation that we think is important. At the same point in time, what I have really liked about working with PEER so far is that I see what I comment in one project over here. When I get another project, my comments from the first project are actually incorporated. So it's not a lesson on a project or something that they only incorporate once. They are really looking at what applies through the whole production cycle that they're running through BMS. And not only that, but I will say, because this has always been a big thing for me when we contribute patient experience data or our own information from what we've learned through various work, BMS always gives me feedback. And so if I give them some feedback on something and they can't incorporate it, they come back and let me know why. And I think that that is really important. We, as advocates, we're not just talking into a void. We really want to see some positive change at the end of the day. And sometimes that's not possible. That's okay. Not permanently okay, but that's okay for now. We'll work on what we can change, and then we'll continue to advocate for those bigger issues in a different way.
You know, Lorna, I'll have to say, along with all of your expertise on the technical issues that you've given, you gave something that I thought was very powerful, and that was the feedback that in our lay summary, we did not thank the caretakers and the patients and put it about them. And I think that changed a lot of our minds right off the bat. So that was awesome too, along with all the other great feedback. So, Deb, let me turn to you. Another one. I don't think any of our panelists could be ghosted, but Deb, talk about some of the experience you've had with PEER.
Well, I don't think I've ever been ghosted. A few people have tried to mute me over time because I'm often bringing up the same kinds of comments. But I think there's a necessary redundancy to some of these some of the issues that we face. So the types of comments that, and I agree with Lorna that they've been very broad. Sometimes I've been asked to look at some text and I've been able to feed back that those aren't words that a patient would ever use. And I'm, very sensitive to where health literacy is. And so, we make language more understandable. Other times it's in very technical details about a trial. And I live and breathe through clinicaltrials.gov. I actually found a mistake in one of the trials in the description and reported that back to BMS to say, you really should fix this trial description. But so we get into the weeds as patient advocates, and sometimes across the different diseases, we're arguing the same thing. So I hear, I work in a different disease area than Lorna does. Lorna was talking about fatigue. That's a very real issue for our patients as well. We also think about other side effects like diarrhea. We're having a side chat in the chat box, but diarrhea, it may be considered by a company just to be, it's just a low-level side effect or grade 2 side effect, and we say, well, hang on a second. If somebody's having 6 or 7 bowel movements every day, that's not a small thing for them. That's, that means they can't work, they can't leave the house. So we introduce sometimes the narrative. I find as the companies deal with the hard data, and yes, everybody wants the numbers of how much longer will this allow you to live, but we also provide that narrative. So I want to do a call out to the patients and caregivers who are listening, is that we need your words. And because when you fill out a survey or when you give feedback, even if it's just, I had a really lousy clinic appointment, and you give that feedback to the patient organization, and choose an organization for your disease or a larger umbrella organization, but just keep giving the feedback, because patients otherwise don't have their words represented. And as a patient myself, I know that sometimes I'm kind of in a rush when I see my oncologist, and I like to, put some lipstick on and pretend that I'm fine, just because I just want to get out of there. I don't want to have too many questions, but I do have important information that I should be sharing about any drug that I'm on. And I remember one time being on a clinical trial, there was a trial, what's called like an amendment, that all of the patients needed to be seen by ophthalmology. So I signed the consent for that and went to ophthalmology. That was 5 hours of having things poked in my eyeballs and all kinds. I can see Jim recoiling. And so I went back to my oncologist on the trial to say, do you have any idea what they're doing to the patients upstairs in ophthalmology? But that's, that was an incredible burden. And I said, this is a make or break for me. If you send me there again, I'm coming off this trial, because that is torture. But we have to be providing this feedback, and other patients on the trial, for whatever reasons, hadn't felt that they could provide that feedback. Maybe they didn't want to be kicked off the trial. Maybe they were trying to be good, compliant patients who always have a smile on their face and say, I'm doing okay. But we need to be brutally honest sometimes. And if you've got really bad diarrhea, describe it in detail until your oncologist is squirming in their seat and wants you to stop. That would be my thought. Feedback, feedback, feedback in your words. That's what we need, and that's what will make the difference.
Jim, can I add one thing to that? I totally agree with Deb. And there's a story that I'd love to share, because while I think that there is a big onus on the patient to provide that feedback, I also want to talk from a provider standpoint too. I think about this as a social worker. I have a colleague who tells a story around the concept of distress screening. So we're talking about the psychosocial health issues. And she said she had a patient who she'd see her, every day for chemo, and she'd be in the office, and she'd say, hey, how are you doing? And the patient would say, just like Deb said, I'm good. I've got my lipstick on. I'm good. I'm hanging in here. And my colleague finally sat down and did a distress screener with her. And it turned out that the patient was suicidal. And my colleague said to her, why you kept telling me you were good? What was going on? And the patient said, you never asked me if I was suicidal. You just sort of said, I don't know if you're being if that's, a real question. So I also want to point out to any providers that may be on here, or providers, MDs that are on clinical trials, or pharmacists, or whomever, that it's also up to you to truly speak to the patient and ask them questions that matter. And patient advocates can help, and patients can help you identify those questions, but we don't really know until we ask patients questions that matter based on what they care about. And so that's an extreme example, but I do think that it's extraordinarily important to understand that don't assume that your patients are okay just because they shrug and say they're okay. All those reasons that Deb gave, patients don't want to be kicked off trial. Patients want to be compliant. So many patients are afraid of their doctor. As a social worker, I would get patients come in and say, my doctor said this and I don't really agree, but I don't feel like I can push back, right? So it's everybody in the healthcare ecosystem. The patient is at the core of what we do, and that's why we have jobs. That's why we do what we do, and they deserve to be asked the questions and attended to in a way that is truly meaningful.
Oh, these examples are powerful. I've always heard about how the patient always thinks they have to be fine. And when I used to be a therapist, that stood for something, which I'm not going to get on. But every time a patient says fine, that does not mean they're fine for the most part. very important. So there's two pieces I want to cover before the end of our hour. And if I may, I'm going to ask Brian to talk about what he sees the immediate and long-term future of PEER. But then for the panelists, if you'd be thinking for our audience, how can they participate in their version of PEER, if I might call it that, or their own personal, because I think you're given, but I'm going to come back to you on that. But Brian, if I may, what do you see the near and long-term future of PEER?
Thanks, Jim. That's a tough question, but thanks for asking. I'll say that, you know, before PEER kicked off, when we had heard from all of our advocacy partners about the need for PEER, and I know the panelists here were really instrumental in the creation of PEER, because they were part of that initial feedback for much more and much better engagement with the pharmaceutical industry. And really gotten it to where it is today. I think we still have a lot of work to do. Again, we've included PEER within our official processes for writing protocols before any of our programs or medicines move to the next phase, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 in drug development. We aim to get input from the expert patient advocates. But really, there's a lot more we can do. I think we've purposefully kept PEER very flexible in the way that we get input from patient advocates. Any input throughout our trials, our patient-reported outcomes tools, or real-world evidence, really any part of our programs, we're aiming to get input. But we're probably working with a small group of advocates. We have about 20 to 25 expert patient advocates across the globe that have been contracted. But I think there are more that we could be working with, more in other disease areas, maybe disease agnostic areas, more feedback that we could maybe get from specific country or national patient advocacy groups, as well as others that we haven't engaged yet. I think there's a huge opportunity to really make this initiative much more full blown and embedded into every step of the drug development process. I did hear one of the inputs that we got really early on in the creation of PEER was from one of our key advocates, and he said, you know, every time you get input from a medical professional, a scientist, or a doctor, why don't you get input from the patient community as well? Doesn't it make sense to get input at that same time point? And I just thought that makes perfect sense. And if we plan ahead in all of our programs, it won't slow down the program at all. It'll actually speed up our drug development, because we'll be engineering a trial that patient community is behind and agrees to and is amenable to what they need. And then overall, the medicine that we developed is what they're looking for. So I think long term, you know, everywhere that we get input from doctors or researchers, we should be getting input from the patient community as well. And that's what we'll continue to aim towards and hopefully build out over time.
Well, hopefully by next year, when we do our next panel, all of you hopefully will be there. You'll be able to say that it has been incorporated, the gold standard. That'd be great. So going back to the panel, I'm going to reach out to you, Lorna. Let's make this about the patients that are listening right now. What can they do wherever they are in their journey, their experience, etc.?
So there are lots of things you can do. What you first though have to figure out is what you're comfortable doing. So when you hear me, you hear Deb, you hear Elizabeth speaking here, we've been working in this space for a long time. So we have lots of knowledge about the in-depth systems that go into developing a clinical trial or doing advocacy work with government, et cetera, to get new drugs approved. You don't have to have that degree of knowledge to have a very important space in this whole sphere. So, you know, when you hear maybe people like us speak and you're thinking, oh my gosh, if I want to be an advocate, I just am not equipped to do this. Don't worry about it. What's most important is that you actually have a story. So you have an experience, and it's those experiences that are actually making a big difference at the end of the day. So one, share. And it could be as easy as filling out an anonymous survey. So, you know, you can do that in the comfort of your home. Because it's anonymous, you can be really clear about everything that you're experiencing and not have to worry if there'll be some ramifications on your current treatment. right? Because sometimes we hear from patients that they don't want to tell their doctors certain things that are happening because they don't want to be taken off a drug that is actually working against their cancer or managing some kind of side effect, even though it's causing other issues for you. So it's a safe place to actually participate from these patient organization-led surveys and make sure your voice is heard. If there are opportunities with your local patient groups, of course, communicate, as Deb said, let people know what you've experienced and see if there's other ways that you could help that way. But I will say this, the biggest thing you can do for yourself is actually communicate to your healthcare professional team. And when we do our global patient survey, we do ask about patient-doctor communication. And we realize there are issues both ways. Doctors don't make it into medical school because they're good communicators. They make it into medical school because they're really smart in science. And so they may not give you information back all the time in an understandable way, but still ask the questions. Tell them you don't understand. Bring somebody with you if you need to, who will help you process that information later. Take notes. If you still don't understand, definitely reach out to a patient organization. They can help you understand what that information actually means. I have spoken to many patients over the years who have come to me and have said, I have B-cell lymphoma. Well, there's like over 80 subtypes of lymphoma. 85% of them are a B cell. I don't really have enough information here about your disease, and neither do you. So let's go back and ask some different questions of the doctor. Talk about your psychosocial concerns as well as what's affecting you medically. There is support available for you if you're having anxiety, if you're having depression, if you're scared of a cancer relapse or cancer progression. But if you're not voicing them, you're not going to find avenues for support. And again, connect with patient organizations because they're great at filling those gaps and providing support groups, one-on-one counseling, buddy systems where you can talk to another patient who's been there done that. So, having conversations and being honest about your needs is extremely important for you. And then also an understanding again from your healthcare professional team about the key issues that patients are facing. If you're not talking about them, they don't know that they exist.
Excellent, excellent advice for every level. And I'm going to switch over to Elizabeth, and especially with your experience as a case manager, what do you see that patients can do to really get involved, to become their own peer?
Sure, and 100% agree with everything that Lorna just said. And I'll sort of start in the same vein that not only do we do this all the time and understand it, but I will also be very transparent that when I go to the doctor, almost every time I leave, I think, oh, I meant to ask those 3 questions and I got there and I went blank, right? And so even, non-cancer appointments, something so simple as a regular checkup. And I thought, oh, I meant to ask X, Y, or Z. We all go through this. So write down your thoughts, write down your questions before you go to the doctor. I think that at the micro level, that's the most important place for a patient to start. Tell their healthcare provider. And Lorna's 1000% correct. It's not just the physical, it's the psychosocial. Deb put in the chat, it's the financial, it is everything you're going through. And when you're going through it during the day, write it down and take that notebook with you or put it in your phone and take it with you everywhere you go so you can talk about that. But please know that even those of us who can speak on a panel about this and talk about patient reported outcomes and grade 2 diarrhea, go blank when we go to the doctor. So it's okay. And we live and learn. The second thing I'll say, my day job at the Cancer Policy Institute is as a policy and advocacy person. So I spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill. And 100% of the time when someone comes with me to Capitol Hill to educate a lawmaker, they are terrified. 100% of the time, I've never known anybody to say, this will be easy, let's do it. Also, 100% of the time after we go to Capitol Hill, they say, it wasn't bad. And the reason is because the patient knows more about their condition than anyone else in this world. And so when you go to Capitol Hill and you're talking, and say this is true of any decision maker, it could be your physician, it could be a legislator, you know more about your personal condition than anybody else. They don't know what it's like to have a certain subtype of B-cell lymphoma. You do. And they need that information to make decisions. So please bring that information and understand that you are the absolute expert. And then finally, the third point that I'll make is I really dislike the word empower. Don't wait for anybody to quote unquote empower you, right? You have the power. As a patient, as a human being, you already have the power. We might be able to provide you with tools and resources to make you feel more comfortable with that, but you are more powerful than you could possibly know. And that's why we're even having this panel, because your voice as a patient got companies, huge multinational companies like BMS to pay attention to you. That's extraordinary. And it's not because of me, it's because of patients like Deb and like Lorna who are on the ground doing this work. So make your voice heard. Don't wait for somebody to empower you. And it's not as scary as you think. So you just got to get out there and do it.
That's great. And yeah, that word empowered is thrown around an awful lot. It means a lot of different things. Deb, I'm going to turn to you because you have the experience both as a patient and as the patient advocate as well. So how did you start to get involved, and how can people start the process?
Well, I was listening to some of this and thinking about, years gone by when I was first diagnosed and when I was on a clinical trial myself, and I was having a miserable time. I was no advocate. I was right in the trenches with other patients and just trying to figure things out. And I think if there are people listening or watching who think, I'm just not feeling good right now, and I'm just scared, and this is all too much, that's okay. If right now, if all you can do is to just journal and to record your thoughts, because believe me, when you survive long enough, you start to forget what it was like in the beginning. So I think, you talk to people around you, certainly, but to journal and to keep a record. I think Elizabeth said, take record into your physician and let them know that, on an average month, this is how many really, really bad days you're having. Maybe they can tweak something. So advocacy starts with you, and it starts with getting yourself into a place. Maybe you can get to a stable disease, or to a place with your disease. Maybe you can knock your disease into remission. And then you can think about, how do I create some meaning out of what has just happened to me? And I think a lot of us as advocates get into this because we do want to make things better for other people who come behind us. And I have a rare type of kidney cancer. It was extremely difficult for me to navigate the healthcare system. And so, part of my mantra was, I'll just tell some other people all of the stuff that I've learned, and maybe it will make it easier for them. So that's essentially how I got started, but I don't want anybody to beat themselves up that on top of having cancer and on top of going through therapy, that they're not doing these things. Because there'll come a time and a place where you'll think, there's a reason that I had some of this, and maybe my meaning is just to help one other individual, or maybe I would like to get involved and volunteer with a local patient organization. That's not everybody's thing, or maybe I would like to try to change the system. And at some point I cross that bridge to say that this isn't good enough. The fact that less than 5% of patients in the United States join clinical trials, that's not good enough. And maybe it's because the clinical trials themselves are not good enough. And so I sort of cross that bridge to say, I'm going to see if we can improve the system. And so for the patients out there, if you haven't signed on to a clinical trial, maybe you can tell your clinician or tell somebody why not. So what have been the reasons? Maybe you've not been asked, maybe you don't know that they're available to you, or maybe you looked at them and you thought, I'm not that crazy, I'm not going to sign for that trial. But it's really, really important that we hear that from you, because if you looked at trials and decided not to do them, as clinical trial advocates, we really need to understand that, because we're trying to design patient-friendly trials that will answer the most important questions. And if people aren't signing up for them, we really need to understand why.
That you mentioned that last week in a conversation, that not just give the feedback on what works, but why didn't a person go into that clinical trial? Such an important piece of it. And maybe someday we'll be able to work that into the PEER program as well. Well, guys, we have about literally a minute and a half. any last words that you really want to get out there? I know this is all so important. I just have to share real quickly back, how far all of us have come. I remember years ago getting those experimental drugs and hearing that they might be toxic, and literally writing a note that I'm sorry I passed away, this drug was toxic. I thought toxic meant you either died or didn't. That's how far I personally have come. And I know we all have funny stories that we can look back on now. Is there anything you want to get out in the next minute that you feel is so urgent for all these people doing such a great job with their own, doing what they can do every day, getting up, doing what they do?
Jim, I want to make one comment, and it's, I see Jacqueline made this comment, something we haven't touched on, and particularly as three white women. I also want to say that patients aren't a monolith, and that whether you're a person of color, a woman, a person from the LGBTQ population, someone with a disability, there can be another layer of challenge for you to make your voice heard or for you to feel comfortable. So I want to give that a moment and give space to that comment, because I think it's extraordinarily important. And I hope that PEER takes into account health equity issues, social justice issues, and incorporating people from all walks of life, all backgrounds into trials, because that is something that is crucial to take from this and something we hadn't touched on yet. So thank you, Jacqueline, for pointing that out. A huge oversight on our part.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks for noticing that. Well, to the panel, I can't thank you enough. To everybody in the audience, I can't thank you enough. We all learn from each other. Everything that was in the chat was so important, and I think we learned from each other. We can keep growing together, and like everybody said, it's so important. Use your voice, whether that's through a survey, talking to your doctor, talking to your pharmaceutical companies, joining a support group, going out and doing a march, whatever it is. We're all in this together, and we all want the same thing, and that's the best quality of life possible. So thank you all, and thanks to Grit for putting this amazing conference on for us all. Have a good one.